Okay, hello YouTube. Today I'm just going to dedicate an entire video to just talking about the zone of the pawn and how it works and different scenarios and scenarios where we win, scenarios where we draw, scenarios where we lose, just so that we can understand this concept completely and we can use it in our games. So anyways, if you like concepts like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So what is the zone of the pawn? Well, the zone of the pawn is the area of the pawn directly to the left or to the right of any locked pawn. So in this case for white, it's the three squares over here, and for black, it's these three squares to the left and to the right of black's pawn. So the question you have to ask yourself when you're talking about the zone of the pawn is, who can get to the zone of the pawn first? And where is the defending king located? Is the defending king threatening to also get to the zone of the other person's pawn, or is the defending king just threatening to defend his own pawn? And that's really critical. So in this case, this is kind of a worst case scenario for black because black's king is over here sort of on the defensive side. He's not on the side where he's going to be trying to attack the zone of white's pawn. It just takes him a little bit too long to get there. Whereas if white makes his first move, you'll notice that white is already threatening to get into the zone of black's pawn, one of these three squares. And he's going to try to get to as close to that zone as possible. Another critical square to keep in mind when we're talking about the zone is the square located directly behind the pawn. Having the ability to touch that square before your opponent can touch the corresponding square behind the pawn is really critical. Because if you're both attacking the zone of the other person's pawn, whoever can get to the square behind the pawn first will typically win. Because they can attack that pawn, force you to take the other square, and then simply slide their king back for a form of zugzwang. In this case, black is going to lose his e-pawn no matter what because white is getting to the zone. So for example, king b5, we could have king g6, king to c4, king f5, king to d5, and black is getting squeezed out of the protection of his own pawn. All of the squares that black can go to that defend the pawn are covered. This one is covered by the pawn, this one is covered by the king. Therefore, the black king has to move away from the protection of his pawn, and then white will capture the pawn. Now, in this particular case, this doesn't mean that black loses. Black can still obtain a draw by getting opposition. And that's why knowing about the zone of the pawn is really important. You have to know when sort of the battle to save your pawn is a lost cause, and you don't even attempt to save it, you just try to get the opposition right after. So in any situation where you have a king and a single pawn, understanding whether or not you're going to lose your pawn is a very critical decision that you need to make, and you need to make that decision quickly. So there are other situations where you have a king and a single pawn, and in some of those situations, you can't quite save it. So take this situation, for example. Notice that the black king is closer to the back end of white's pawn than white's king, and notice that in this case, white's king is in the unfavorable circumstance of being behind his pawn. Also, the black king can get to the back of the pawn before the white king can get to the back of the pawn. So in this situation, regardless of who moves, black should win. And I did say win, because even if you understand that you're losing your pawn here, you should actually still lose. So for example, after king b2, we're going to play king g2, king c3, king f2. We touched the back of that pawn first. That forces a defense. Notice that we can't go to the d3 square because the black pawn covers. We'll have to defend with king d4. And then we're simply going to slide that king back, king f3, and that's going to be winning. The king is going to be forced away from the defense of his pawn. The black king will take, get out of the way, we'll make a queen, we'll win very easily. So you're probably wondering, well, if we recognized that we were losing, why even try to go for the black end of black's pawn? Why not just hang back and get that opposition? And that's a good question. We could have hung back. We could have played something like king d2, king f3. We are winning this pawn. But now we can play something like king to d1, king takes e3, and gain the opposition, and you might think that you're saving the draw here. But in this case, the black king is far enough up the board that we can employ something called sixth rank rule, which basically means that we get the opposition at the very last moment. After king d3, king d1, e3 obtains the opposition. And then after king e1, we have e2, king f2, king d2, completely winning. We're going to be queening that pawn. So if the pawn is far enough advanced and the kings are located in bad spots, by employing the zone of the pawn, you actually have a winning position. Other scenarios where you have a winning position would be any situation where you have a king and 2 pawns. So in this case, notice that the white king is very, very close to the black pawns. And as a matter of fact, white is going to get to the zone of these pawns. And if it's black's move, black isn't going to be able to stop it. He can play king g6, king c4, king f5, king d4. Black will be squeezed out of the protection of that pawn. That's going to be the end of it. We're going to have king e6, king takes e4, king d6, king takes d3. This will be a very easy win for white. White's got 2 passed pawns. The opposition doesn't really matter at this point. So what happens as we start adding more and more pawns? How does this change the scenario? How does it change the zone? Well, let's say that we have 3 pawns. And let's say that only 2 out of those 3 pawns are locked. So these 2 pawns are locked. This pawn isn't locked. Now, whenever you're calculating the zone of a pawn, or the zone of pawns, you always have to look at the base of the pawn. So if we eliminated these 2 h pawns, the base would be g5 for black and f3 for white. The base of the pawn chain is the zone of the pawn. In this case, the zone of black's pawn is going to be that h6 pawn. But since we don't have a pawn on h5, the zone doesn't extend for a full 3 squares. As a matter of fact, when you don't have the pawn on h5, the only adjustment you have to make to your zone is the zone only extends 2 squares. So I can still win this pawn as long as I can get to the f6 square. The issue here is white cannot get to the f6 square under any circumstances if black plays correctly. So for example, if I continue with pawn to h3, gaining the opposition, and we simply have king f6, king d5, notice that the 3 pawns to the left or to the right are not the zone, so even if I get to this square right here, I'm not in the zone yet. I have to get to f6. We would have king e7, king here, king here, king here, gaining the opposition, king here, and normally this would be the zone, but the g6 square is available. Now if I had a pawn on h5, that h6 pawn would have a 3-square zone. And if it had a 3-square zone with that pawn on h5, I would be winning. So it's very important to understand the very minor differences between these two things. In this case, after king g6, the position is completely equal. And even in some weird scenario where I could maneuver my king back to g8, like let's just say I played king e7, and then let's just say for fun king g7, and then we're going to have some not so best moves here, king d7, king g6, king e8, just to get my king to g8 where I have the opposition. Black is still okay here. Even though at this point you're technically squeezing out the king vertically, black can play h5, and then we can have this exchange, and then black can go for the base of white's pawns while white goes for the base of black's pawns, and then both sides are going to queen at the same time because they were the same distance from the base. So this is how it works, and we're going to have a draw. Going back to that example again where we had the king on g7, what happens if we do manage to get to one of these 2 squares? Well, if we do manage to get to one of these 2 squares, the game will effectively be over. So, for example, let's say king g7, king e6, and then black, for whatever reason, blunders and plays king to h7. We can play king f7 and get the opposition, or we can even just obtain any square within this zone, and we will be winning. As soon as we hit that f6 square, there is nothing black can do to prevent us from winning that pawn. We are squeezing the black king out of the protection of that pawn, and then we're simply going to come over here, take it, and then once we take it, the rest of the chain falls. And then we win. So that brings us to kind of our final position. It's a game that I witnessed years and years ago that has to do with understanding the zone of the pawn. Maybe this is the most critical position of all for understanding the zone of the pawn, understanding the 2 locked pawn principles, etc. Right now, none of the pawns are locked. But if at any point the pawns did lock, the base of the pawn chain would be your zone. So right here, the zone for white would be this, and the zone for black would be this. And right now, neither side can legitimately get to the zone, so best play would just be something simple, like each side would shuffle their kings back and forth, nothing would happen, and we would all go home. That's not what happened in this game that I saw. This was a game I saw played between they were class players. They were either class C or class B players, and the game continued to my horror. White played this move, pawn to f5 check. double question mark, major blunder, game-losing move. And if you understand the zone of the pawn, you can see why. White has transferred the zone of his pawn from f4 to f5. This is now officially the zone of that pawn once it gets exchanged and that pawn gets locked. So all black would have to do to win the game is simply lock this pawn structure, move his king to the side. He's threatening to get to the zone. And then when white obtains the opposition, he simply pushes his pawn, and now he has the opposition. White has to concede the zone. And remember, in any case where we have 2 pawns on the board, not just one, once we get to the zone of that pawn, we're winning. Because we're going to take the second pawn. So when this king moves away, we're going to play king to c5. We're going to snatch up that pawn on f5. And then eventually we're going to take the pawn on h4. We're taking that second pawn. There's no way that you're going to be able to survive this position. So, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here, takes here. We get to the zone of the other pawn, threaten to queen this pawn. We can eventually take that pawn. It doesn't matter. It's over. Okay? So, after f5 check, what did black play? He has a win. He has g takes f5, g takes f5, king d6, king d4, h5 winning, right? Well, of course, he played king f7 because he doesn't realize that it matters. And now, the position is still objectively equal at this point, but, white actually played pretty aggressively. He played king to d5. Now, black still has a chance to save this position. He needs to find the move pawn to h5. If he plays h5, all the pawns liquidate, and it's equal. So, for example, h5, and notice the structure's still fluid, so these pawns aren't quite locked yet. That's another critical thing. So like h5, we would have something like fg6, king g6, takes, everything liquidates, no more pawns left, it's a draw. Another situation with h5, we could take this way, we could play gf5, then he takes this way, then each side goes to the front of the other person's pawns, they gobble up all the pawns, and that's a draw. Okay, so h5, after king d5, h5 is the last chance, right? Did that happen? Of course not. The move that got played was king to g7. Now, of course, we should have an easy win here. Now, king e6, as tempting as it looks, keep in mind, if we play king e6, this pawn structure is still fluid, so h5 is still a thing. That's still a possibility that black has at his disposal. If king e6, we can play h5, and that's bad. So I think white realized that, and instead of playing the move that wins, he played the move f captures g6, and the game ended in a draw. It went fg6, king g6, and then the position is equal. Nobody made any serious further mistakes, but nobody made any progress either. But the game ended in a draw. Now, if white wants to win, all white has to do is play the move pawn to h5, and the game is over. It locks the pawns, and that's it. After takes, say king f7, all we have to do is get to the zone of that f6 pawn, and since there's 2 pawns on the board, that's going to be game over. So king d6 is going to be winning. So an example would be, king g7, king e6, king here, takes, here, and again, it doesn't matter if we'd gotten the opposition because we're going to be taking this second pawn, and that's going to be the end of the game. You can't get the opposition without giving up the pawn on h6. So anyways, that's the zone of the pawn. That's understanding the zone of the pawn, using the zone of the pawn to your advantage, understanding how to win games using this concept of the zone of the pawn. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.